Well, thank you very much for having me. And as I was just starting to say, I regret not being here in person, which I had been planning on. Um, and many thanks to Joe Ellen and August for arranging for my presentation remotely on short notice today. Um, I'm going to talk about two of the original eight families of Linden Hills, those being the Gray and Chapin families, corresponding with my two maternal grandparents, Elizabeth Gray and Harold Fountain Chapin. Um, and I grew up on the East Coast, and I came to Minneapolis just coincidentally in early 1996. I was unaware of where, and I knew that my grandparents had been from Minneapolis and from prominent families there, but I didn't know anything about like where they lived. And it wasn't until I moved to Lake Harriet Parkway in 2001 that I saw some dresses on some family papers and realized that my grandparents were right around the corner, and that I'd never known that they would have known each other as children. But being that they were from some of the first families and lived just a few blocks away, they undoubtedly knew each other as children, and that was sort of interesting to me. Shortly after I moved in, I was walking by the Chapin's house, which is a familiar one, still there, 4224 South Queen. And I got into a conversation with John Lundquist, the owner, and he knew all about the Chapin family and pointed me to the Firehouse restaurant where this group's exhibit was. And I was astounded when I got there to see all these pictures of my great-grandparents and family stories and so forth. I had no idea that existed and that I lived around the corner. The Grays and Chapin, both the Elizabeth Gray and Harold Fountain Chapin, both had a lot of common ancestral type roots, and I think that's important because they're probably quite typical of the early Linden Hills residents, old Yankee New England families that moved up to upstate New York when that was the frontier and became safe after the Revolution. And then when all the land was taken up there, moved on to the Minnesota Territory. And in fact, my two grandparents were both descended from the original Chapin progenitor in the New World. And not only that, when the Chapins did a lot of clan breeding in Massachusetts. When I go on Ancestry DNA, I get all these hits from people whose closest relatives are the Chapin and his wife from 10 generations ago, which you usually wouldn't get. But being that they are my great, great, great whatevers, probably about 20 times over from more than one side of the family, their input is magnified. Okay, so this is Harold Colton Chapin. His father, Nathan Colton Chapin, was a Congregationalist minister, a Yale graduate, moved to Minneapolis, and Harold Colton Chapin started the Chapin Publishing Company in 1892. They were on the top floor of the Lumber Exchange building for about 100 years, and they did a lot of trade journals, especially in the real estate area. His wife's name was Virginia Coe. And the next photograph, I think, is there we have the Chapins moved to 4224 Queen in 1899, and there it is from right around then. And then the next photograph is the Chapins barn, and if you travel on the street behind South Queen, you can see that the Chapins barn has been converted to a house today. The next photograph, this is a daguerreotype of Mrs. Chapin's father. Now, the only reason I'm including this is because any history buff who owns a daguerreotype is looking for an excuse to show it off. So sorry about that. Anyway, he was a delegate to the statehood convention and a Minneapolis alderman, but I don't think he lived in Linden Hills, so we won't go on further with him. The sons of this couple, Harold Fountain Chapin and Rollin. Harold Fountain was my grandfather. They grew up in Linden Hills, and they started a newspaper called the Linden Hills News, or went by some other titles at some points. And I think the next photograph, that's Harold Fountain Chapin as a young man. And then the next photograph after that, that's the Linden Hills News. Using their father's publishing company, they created this neighborhood newspaper, which they ran with for about 5 years. And kind of ironically, I didn't know anything about that till relatively recently. And it's ironic because I started my own little neighborhood newspaper just like it when I was growing up. The next photograph is where they went to school, the Linden Hills School, the original one. And from the photograph, you can see that for boys at least, shoes were not required and apparently discouraged. Fairly interesting difference between what you'd see in school today and back then. Anyway, the company did pretty well, and the next photograph shows the Chapin family in their cars that they used to drive around Lake Harriet Parkway, and they were committed to this activity, and that they wrote a bunch of poems about it that I've got. Anyway, you can see Harold doesn't even have doesn't drive the car himself. If you're a well-to-do owner of a new automobile in 1900, you generally had a driver for your new contraption, and they appear to be electric cars. So the Chapins were 125 years ahead of their time with the electric car. Okay, so Harold Colton Chapin, he was out in 1912 on Lake Harriet taking his nightly spin in his canoe, and he was found drowned with the canoe overturned. So unfortunate demise of Harold, and his wife, Virginia, still lived on Queen Street until 1921, at which point she moved to the Central Ward. So then another one of the 8 families was the Gray family. And this was James Gray and his wife, Grace Farrington. And I can't see you, but I'll ask by a show of hands, how many of your great-grandparents met in professional positions in the workplace in the 1890s? I can't see you, but I'm predicting there were no hands showed. So this is an interesting couple for that reason in of itself. They met when James was the editor of the Minneapolis Times, and Grace was a columnist. And, she's a pretty serious columnist, too. Here you see her book of a collection of her columns, Dreams and Ideals, which came out about 1900. And I found the most interesting one was her inveighing against corporal punishment. And she had a lot of what we would look back on as very advanced and progressive views on corporal punishment, which of course was much more common back in those days. Grace was born in near Jamestown, New York, and she got her start in high school writing articles as a stringer for the Buffalo newspapers, and she moved to Minneapolis with her mom and sister when her mom married a doctor who was going there, and that's about 18 1890, and that is how she came to work at the Times. Meanwhile, James, her husband, was born in Falkirk, Scotland, in 1862, and came here with his family, and that will be the next picture. And the interesting thing you'll see, that's about 1870. The interesting thing about this immigrant family is that all 7 of them came, the parents were in their 40s, James is on the far right, so, along with the father's brother and his crew of 7. And I usually, if you could afford 7 passages to the New World, you were probably doing well enough in the Old World that you didn't want to do it. So it's kind of unusual. Most immigrant stories involve a son, or perhaps a son and a daughter, being sent together to America, and the family saving up for that. These people seem to be a little bit different. The father was a miller who had a patent on cooling devices for grain elevators. So James, he ended up in Minneapolis after a pit stop in Dubuque, and he went and took the admissions test at the U, but he was so sure that he had failed that he didn't bother leaving them an address. And when the school determined that he had the highest grade by far on the admissions test, they had to go through quite a process of tracking him down over a period of weeks around town. And they finally found him and enrolled him, and he was a valedictorian of the class of 1885. Next photo is his college photo. Yep, there's James. If you look at a photo of myself, the same age, boy, a lot of resemblance. But anyway, that his graduating class was not 5,000, but approximately 20. But still, valedictorian's valedictorian. And through that experience, he became a close friend of Cyrus Northrop for the rest of his life. And he went into the newspaper business, and there he meets Grace on the staff. And I'm going to read you a letter written by Grace to a friend, an excerpt from it, about this Mr. Gray, who is her boss. Have I told you about Mr. Gray? He is quite a brilliant young man, a scholar and a forcible writer. At the time of the 1892 Republican Convention in Minneapolis, he wrote an article so exceptional in vigorous thought and literary finish that it attracted the attention of politicians and newspapermen all over the country. He writes bright little poems and keen editorials, and his Scotch wit and scathing irony are proverbial here. He is an interesting character. You would admire him. He is typically Scotch, with all the rugged integrity and practical cynicism of his nationality on the outside, and at heart, all a Caledonian's poetry and refinement. But my love of analysis is running away with me. He was recently voted most popular member of the press club. He leaves in June to spend the summer in the Highlands. I would speculate that something beyond her love of analysis is what was running away with her. But it's interesting to hear the narrative and to think, I don't think you quite get literary narrative like that in social media postings from 20-year-old women today. And so you get a picture of what Grace is about from those letters. And, she could even be a little bit pedantic. If you look at her collected papers at the Minnesota Historical Society, you'll find things like 10-page letters in Latin. And if you couldn't read her 10-page letter in Latin that she sent to you, you were an unworthy correspondent anyway. So that's kind of what Grace was about. The next photo is the Gray's house on Sheridan. The oldest child is my grandmother, Elizabeth. Can't see Grace too well there. And that house was knocked down in about 1930. 3 of the 4 Gray children are in that photograph. Meanwhile, James is impressing people in the newspaper business, and one person reading his editorials is William Jennings Bryan, who recommends him to the Democrat committee in Minneapolis, and he had not intended to go into politics, but becomes the Democrat nominee for mayor and then the mayor in 1898, shortly before he moved to Linden Hills. And he got a real puff piece shortly after that in the Saturday Evening Review, which of course was a big deal at the time. I think the next photo is his mayoral portrait. That's from about 1900. And then after that, we should have, we missed the Saturday Evening Review. The Saturday Evening Review article also touches on Mr. and Mrs. Gray, and it reads, a paragraph that reads, "It was during his service on the Times that the rose light of romance touched Mr. Gray's life. There was a sweet-faced, demure young woman, quote, doing society, unquote, under his supervision. Although City Editor Gray was much opposed to the employment of women in newspaper offices and had, moreover, something of a reputation as a woman hater, or at least a woman ignorer, it was soon noted that his views were undergoing a change. He found it necessary to give the society editor frequent counsel, instruction, and assistance. In the end, he made her Mrs. Gray." So that was some purple prose courtesy of one Winthrop Chamberlain of the Saturday Evening Post. So the highlight of James' term as mayor was a visit from President McKinley upon the return of the 13th Volunteers of Minnesota from the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. And you can see James with the top hat on the right and President McKinley. And my mom says that was the first electric car in the state of Minnesota. So both the Grays and the Chapins are spinning around in electric cars under 25 years early. Now, the next photograph should be the gathering that both McKinley and Mayor Gray spoke at. There used to be a giant mural of this in the lobby of City Hall. And I guess it's probably been mothballed now, but I was, kind of astounded to walk in and see that as well. Now, there may have been a presidential visit to Linden Hills. I may speculate. My mom said, and she showed me a picture of the house on Sheridan, all decorated for the visit. And she said that McKinley came to the house. I do not see confirmation of that in limited attempts to do research on the subject. So we're just going to have to leave that as possible urban myth or exaggerated family storytelling, or it may be the case, because I did see the picture. I couldn't find it, of the house, really, like the living room and the outside, all decorated for the presidential visit. Anyway, Mayor Gray lost to the notorious Doc Ames, the boss Tweed of Minneapolis politics, a few years later. James had been a reformer, and he was resistant to the corrupt demands of what was called the West Hotel crowd. And I've seen his papers, and the West Hotel crowd was just really obvious and blatant in writing, letters demanding favors and basically demanding that he engage in graft of one variety or another, which Doc Ames, by contrast, was all too willing to participate in. But he was drawn back into politics and was the Democrats' nominee for governor in 1910. And at that time, the big issue was prohibition and what was called the county option, which would give counties in Minnesota the option of going dry. And he was dry, as most progressives were, and this did not go over well with the burgeoning German and Scandinavian population, as you might imagine. And so James lost the governor's race and did not participate further in politics. He went back to newspaper. He became one of the newspapers in town. He became the Washington correspondent for, and unfortunately had a coronary at his desk in 1916 and died in Washington. And after that, Grace moved back here. I think we see, if we've got that next picture of Grace, yeah, there's Grace with her youngest son Philip around that time in 1916. The four children who grew up in Linden Hills: Elizabeth, Jean, James, and Philip. One anecdote I would drop about my grandmother is my mom used to say she had to walk 10 miles in 20 degree below zero weather to school in Minnesota. And I found out she went to West High School, and I did a measure from the 400 block of Sheridan to West High School. It's more like 2 miles than 10. So that's the way these things mushroom over the years. Now, changing the subject a little bit on these children, the most august of publishing houses, Charles Scribner and Sons in New York, published 2 novels in the year 1925 by young Twin Cities author. One was called The Great Gatsby by one F. Scott Fitzgerald. The other was called The Furrowed Brow by James Gray of Linden Hills. And this is James Gray, the son of the mayor, who I actually knew as Uncle James in the day. And he wrote a bunch of novels, and you can get them out of the Minneapolis Public Library. The best one I can tell you is called The Vagabond Path, which was his last one, which he did in 1940. Okay, I'm just about done. The other son, Philip, he drowned in the pond at Carleton College, and you'll see him listed as a Carnegie Foundation hero. And Grace continued as a journalist, and I have a autograph photograph of Amelia Earhart that Grace got when she interviewed Amelia and brought back to my mom. I would just conclude, my concluding thought is that you can see these two families are pretty interesting, successful, and young, and here they were eschewing the Central Ward or Kenwood, which were more fashionable in the day. And I have a saying that every neighborhood started as an exurb, and the same can be said for Linden Hills. So these two families were really up and coming in their 30s when they moved there, select families who were moving out to the exurbs. However you might think of that today. Okay, thank you very much for hearing me out on all this.
Thank you. What fascinating families. We have maybe time for just a couple questions. Is there anybody?
Sure.
I just want to know the name of that first Times, is it newspaper, that one of your early relatives...
The Minneapolis Times.
Thank you.
He was the editor of several, I think the Minneapolis Journal at one point, but the Minneapolis Times was the one that Grace was writing at when they met. And I don't know, in the everything used to, they're all part of the Star Tribune now. They all merged and merged and merged until they were one.
I think that's it for now. Jonathan, that was really interesting. Really appreciate your time, and sorry you weren't here with us.
Yeah, I'm sorry as well.
Okay.
I'll let you go on.
Okay.
And by the way, the Grays were members of the church you're sitting in now. And before the building was built, Elizabeth, my grandmother, was baptized in the woods behind the church when they were building it.
Really? Oh, interesting. Fascinating. All right. Thank you. So now
Bye-bye.
move on to the Crandalls.
Well, thank you for having us. My name is Ed Crandall. My sister, Carolyn Bremner, we call her Boo, but she is also a Crandall, and she's here. She doesn't like the spotlight, so. I don't have quite as many interesting stories as that, but I do have a long history in Linden Hills. We've been here on Linden Hills Boulevard for 118 years, and we're still there. So, we have a few slides. My grandfather was actually raised in Red Wing, and he came to Minneapolis in the early 1900s and was in the lumber business. He worked at the Lumber Exchange building, which I think was mentioned earlier, and so he was in the lumber business. And when he first started working in the lumber business, he worked for a wholesaler, and then he opened his own lumber yard, which is called Crandall Cath Lumber, and it became Hiawatha Lumber over on Hiawatha at Minnehaha Parkway. And so 118, we had 6 different addresses in 5 different buildings on Linden Hills Boulevard. So this is the house that my grandfather built in 1906. They also lived for a short time down on Thomas at about 44th, I think it was, on Thomas, while the house was being built. The house, the picture on the right is as the house is today. We sold the house. My wife and I lived there for about 30 years, and we sold it, and the Breams who bought it, they did a lovely job remodeling it, spent a bunch of money and did a bunch of landscaping, and it really, they maintained the look of the house. I think you can see the interesting part of the old house was that it had these porch extensions, which stuck out behind the porch, which I always thought was kind of odd. And for a long time, the stairs actually went down into the driveway as opposed to in the front, but now they have them back in the front. So my grandfather built the house in 1906. As I mentioned, he had Crandall Cath Lumber, which became Hiawatha. They raised 5 kids there, and my father was born in 1906, and that was about the time they moved into the house. We lived there for a number of years, extensively remodeled in 2007, and then remained in the family, and then also sold in 2016, and even more remodeling. So basically, I'm going to go through the 6 addresses. Oh, this is an interesting photo. My grandfather built a slide up on the left side. The second photo was a slide that they built that went from the back of the house down to Queen, which was a vacant lot at that time. And then what we assume is that they were to traverse the boulevard or the street on Queen to this slide that was built, I think somewhere around 1910 or 1912, that went down from Queen all the way down to Lake Harriet. So it's an interesting, that you can see, I think I'm not sure if that's my father or it's one of my aunts up on the top of it. That's my dad, okay. The photo on the left is my family, my dad and his sisters and 2 brothers, and that you may recognize that band shell. That's from that vintage of probably about 1914 or 1915. And the photo on the right is in the front of 4237. You kind of can see that there's not a whole lot of buildings built on the block at that time. I'm not sure when the first houses were built on Linden Hills Boulevard, but at this point there were not too many. This is where I grew up, 4042 Linden Hills Boulevard. My mother and dad bought that in the 40s and lived there for a long time. I was raised there. Boo was also raised there as well. And it was red almost the whole time up until last year, and it was painted white, 4042. This is 4236, so that's right across the street from my grandfather's original home. And 4236 was where Boo raised her kids. And it was purchased in 62 and sold in 96. The original house was torn down and replaced, and this house, I think they did a lovely job of building a home that fits into Linden Hills Boulevard. And it's probably 10 years old now, and it's a really, really nice home. Boo and her husband Russ moved from, after they sold 4236, moved into 4259 Linden Hills Boulevard, which is on the corner where the street curves around to the lake. And we're there for 6 years or so? 8 years, okay.
Until we bought the duplex.
Right. And then this, Boo and Russ and Mary Beth, my wife, and I purchased this duplex at 4017, 4019. There's two addresses, Linden Hills Boulevard, and that's where I live today. Boo lived there for, again, about 5 or 6 years. And it's a great building. It was built in 1925, and we remodeled it. We actually went into the lower level and added some space on the lower level. So that's it. It's pretty simple. 6 houses, 6 addresses, 5 buildings, 118 years on Linden Hills Boulevard. Thank you.
Very good. Excellent. So then we'll go on to Nicola. Oh, yes, thank you. And Carl, if you two want to have a seat here.
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Nicola Pine, and we'll be talking about 3805 Ewing Avenue South. In advance. Okay. So this is a photo of me and my younger brother in 1976 with our dog Simon in the background. And I grew up at 3805 Ewing, which is in the northwest corner of Linden Hills, 1 block east of France Avenue and across the street from Minnetonka Golf Course. My parents bought this house in 1974, and I lived there until 1989. My parents continued to live at 3805 Ewing for the next 35 years, raising me and my younger siblings there. A year ago, they sold the house and moved into a senior housing community. It was this transition, along with finding the original blueprints of the house and a box of construction planning documents that were found when packing up my parents' belongings, and getting connected to Carl Adamek, whose grandparents built this house, that inspired me to research my house's history.
And I'm Carl Adamek, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've never lived in Linden Hills. As a child, I visited a lot at 3805 Ewing. As Nicola said, my grandparents built the house, and in a few minutes I'll share some stories about the time of the construction of the house. But I have very fond memories of this area, particularly holiday time in the dining room, parties thrown. And I'm having a little of a flashback here of the bright lights, because I'm going to tell you a story about 8mm movies in a moment and how it relates to bright lights like this when I was a kid. So more to come.
Yes, I'm having flashbacks from being 5 at Audubon School and being on stage for Alice in Wonderland.
I'll mention real quick, this picture is myself and my younger sister in the driveway of 3805 Ewing when we were kids.
Yep, and the picture that was 2 before was of me and my brother in that same driveway, different perspective. When I started researching the history of my parents' house, it was important for me to acknowledge that the history of the land that became 3805 Ewing did not begin when the house was built, or even when the land was platted. The land Minneapolis is built upon is the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. Before this land was forcibly taken and the Dakota people were removed from Minnesota, Indigenous people lived, hunted, fished, and gathered food in this area. The land near 3805 Ewing was a natural watershed with marshes and would have been ideal for wild rice gathering, hunting, gathering nuts and berries, and fishing. It is important for me to take the time to think about that history. My research started in the early 1900s. The northwest corner of Linden Hills was one of the last areas in the neighborhood to be developed. North of the block, which is indicated in red, is Minnetonka Golf Course, which was founded in 1898. South of the block, at the bottom of the hill, was a marshy area that was not suited for development. As you can see in this plat map from 1913, there is very little development on the western side, a handful of houses that have been built. The area to the east, closer to Bademakoska, was called Cottage City back then and started out as a vacation home area, eventually becoming incorporated into Minneapolis. This area had trolley service starting in 1898, just to give you a sense of how different these parts of Linden Hills were back then. In the 1930s, the 3800 block of Ewing began to take shape. A bit further away from Bademakoska and Cottage City, the lots between 38th and 39th Street and between Xerxes and France Avenue were marketed mainly to upper middle class people and were slightly larger than the average lot size at that time. What you are looking at in this plat map is the east and west sides of Ewing Avenue between 38th and 39th Street, Minnetonka Golf Course on the north. The first houses to be developed on Ewing were at the top, northern end of the block. The very first house on this block was built at 3801 Ewing in 1927, and 3805 Ewing was the third house to be built on the block in 1932. A total of 6 houses were built by 1937. After that, no other houses were built on this block until the 1950s due to the downturn of the economy and the lack of materials available for construction during World War II. Here's the original lot survey done for 3805 Ewing on September 12, 1932. Lot surveys were conducted by surveyors to establish the property lines for specific properties at the time the house or building was first constructed. In 1932, Carl and Bertha Liebeck purchased the land that became 3805 Ewing. Trained as a civil engineer, Carl worked in the sash and door and window business as a salesman and went on to start his own commercial construction business, Liebeck and Company. Carl was involved in every aspect of the design and construction of the 3805 Ewing home. His brother Roy Liebeck was brought in as a construction manager to help with the project, and his wife Bertha managed the books. The above blueprint is one of many rolls of blueprints that were left in the house for what was to be their dream home. For the next year, the house began to take shape. Here is the permit card for 3805 Ewing. You can see when the major aspects of the house were started and when the final inspection took place. For example, the initial work was started in September of 1932, electrical in October, and lath and plastering in November. The final inspections didn't take place until between January and September of 1933. Here is the house cost sheet from when 3805 Ewing was built. Carl and Bertha kept very meticulous records, and from them you can see that they purchased the lot for $1,000, and the total cost of the house's construction was around $7,500. This is just one example of the hundreds of construction records that were saved. They are fascinating documents with so many clues about the construction process and where the materials were sourced, but also information about the Liebeck family and what life was like for an upper middle class family during this time period. In this letter, Carl Liebeck has written to the Lawson and Nelson Company about the automatic covers on the flour and sugar bins in the kitchen, which were not working correctly. He also says that the family planned to move in later that week, February 7th, 1933. So we know that even though the house wasn't completely finished, the family was already living there. One great thing about being able to connect with the previous owners of your house is that you can often get so much information about the house from family photos. It also takes historical documents like plat maps and permit cards and puts them in the context of real people with real lives. This photo is of Carl Liebeck's eldest daughter, Susan, in the winter of 1933, shortly after they moved into the house. It is also the first photo of the house that we have, and it tells us so much about the house at that point. For example, the backyard screened-in porch was not built yet, and we can tell that the garage had folding doors that opened to the side, and that the one on the far right could also be used like a regular door with hinges to get into the garage. Here is Carl Liebeck with his 2 daughters, Anne and Sue, in 1937. The house is now completed, and he is able to enjoy it with his family. It was astonishing to me when I saw this photo that my parents moved into this house in 1974, almost 40 years later, and the front of the house looked identical to how it looked in this photo. Here are Anne and Sue Liebeck in the original kitchen of the 1930s. Life was both similar and quite different at 3805 Ewing in the 30s to 50s than today. There was an ice box in the kitchen instead of a fridge. Most laundry was pressed after washing using a mangle iron, which took up most of the laundry room, and explains why the laundry room took up half the basement. Many items, such as coal, milk, and ice, were delivered with horse and buggy. The closest trolley was on 44th Street, but there was a trolley bus spur with its final stop on 39th and Chowan. From census and newspaper job posting records, I learned that there was a maid living in the house with a family from 1937 until the early 40s. In 1940, the U.S. Census states that the maid's name was Arlene Danielson, and she was from Douglas, Minnesota, and was 14 years old. She helped with the laundry and cooking and lived in one of the upstairs bedrooms. As was true with many families during the Depression, farming families were in dire straits and trying to earn an income any way they could. Sending a daughter to the cities for maid work not only brought income to the family, but also provided the child safe and warm housing and a stable diet. I was lucky enough to connect with Carl Adamek around the time that the house was being sold. Carl and his sister Maggie met with me and my sister Caitlin and shared stories of their grandparents' house and what it was like to live there. I'll now have Carl share a few photos from his family and talk about the house and his memories when his grandparents lived there.
Thanks, Nicola. And first, I just want to say that my grandparents who built the house, and I'll get into that in a moment, sold it in 1974 to Nicola's parents. And my grandparents were so happy that they sold it to the Pines because here was a nice young family. Mother and father were doctors that they felt really good handing the keys off to the next generation, along with piles and piles of paperwork, as you referred to earlier, records of the house. But my sister called me about 2 years ago, I think it was a year and a half ago, and said, Carl, look online, 3805 Ewing is for sale. And I hadn't been in the house since 1974. So I went online, found the realtor's number, and I called the realtor and I said, I'm the grandson of the people who built the house. I'm not interested in buying it, but could you possibly contact the owners to see if it'd be okay if my family went and looked at the house? And Nicola's parents were nice enough to say yes. And we went in there was no with this. We went in by ourselves and walked into the front door, and obviously memories flooded back. In 74, the last time I was in, I was 10 years old. But nothing had changed. The only thing that had changed was at some point the Pines had pulled the carpet up to show the hardwood floors. When my grandparents were in, there was carpet everywhere, but the fireplace was the same. The tools for the fireplace were the same. There's photographs when my mother was 1 year old sitting next to the fireplace, next to those fireplace tools. And I got to show my son and my daughter, my wife, so 4 generations had been able to go in and at least be in the house. So I want to thank you for that and your family. Appreciate that. So what I've learned in reading, and there's actually 2 key pieces of history that I hold on to, is my grandfather was born in northeast Minneapolis of Swedish background. His parents came over from Sweden, so he was first generation American born. He was also the first generation that actually English is a first language. So his parents spoke Swedish. He was born at the Swedish hospital in northeast Minneapolis. And his father was the chief operating officer for a sash and door manufacturer by the name of H.S. Johnson. And so he grew up a upper middle income family. And as a young man, learned quite quickly from his father that it was important to save as much money as you could. It was important to invest in stocks and put money in bonds, and you're never too young to get started, so son, get started. Which my grandfather, Carl, who I'm named after, followed suit and did that, which became of benefit later on in building the house. My grandmother, Bertha, we called her Grandma Bert, was born just north of Boston. Her family came over from Scotland to Canada in the early 1800s. And my great-grandfather came down to Maine in about 1842, and his brother went to the Civil War and was imprisoned in Andersonville, Carolinas, if anyone's familiar with that. But in any event, my grandmother's father, David McCrae, moved to Minneapolis for actually a laborer's job in the 1880s. And my grandfather was born in 1897. My grandmother was born in 1899. My grandmother grew up on Queen Avenue North and is actually where my grandparents got married. The photo here on June 9th, 1928. They both went to the University of Minnesota, and I was telling Nicola earlier, I can't even imagine the time. So they were in college at the U during World War I and the Spanish flu. My grandfather was drafted into the Navy, but because he was an upperclassman, he was a junior at the U, he didn't have to serve per se. His service was to get his engineering degree, and by the time he got that, they weren't calling up anyone else to the war. But the Spanish flu was going on, so there was a lot of quarantining going on. And then, of course, as you all know, we moved into the 20s. The Depression started to hit, and by God, Grandpa and Grandma decided to build a house in 1932-33. So my point earlier about investing, which is my other favorite book, is my grandfather wrote a little diary that he only wrote something in it the first of every year, and he started in 1923. And what he put in his diary was, here's all my assets, here's my liabilities, and then there was a paragraph of remarks. And the remarks were generally, I think business went well this year, I'm hoping for a promotion or more money next year. But one of the blurbs, his first job out of college was with the Minneapolis City of Engineers office, and he was a salesperson, which I'm still trying to connect, what are salespeople doing working for the city, but I don't know, but he did. There were 6 salesmen, 5 of them did their rounds every day on horse, and my grandfather was the only one who had an automobile. And so he was able to get his daily rounds done in half the time that the others did on horse, so he was done every day by noon, which is why he became a one-handicap golfer and at one point almost decided to go pro. But I gained my passion for golf from my grandfather, and not only that, but we went sliding at Minnetonka Country Club in the winters. He knew how to get through the fence, and we did all that. But, interesting time with that. He started out well doing that. He had an automobile. That was one of the assets he always listed here. But my favorite little remark was in 1927. He wrote in his remark, he says, I'm at a point that I'm a stable man. It must be my time now to find the woman of my desires and marry her. And you fast forward 1 year later at the end of 1928, and he said, I found the woman of my desires and I married her on June 9th, 1928. Her name is Bertha McCrae, and I'm a very happy man. Now it's time to find a safe home to provide for her. And so the story begins about building the house. So in any event, we talked about World War I, the Spanish flu, and then the Depression. And because of the investing and savings acumen that my grandfather's father instilled in him, he had a fair amount of assets in the late 20s. But in the beginning of 1929, he had a savings account at a bank in downtown Minneapolis where he had 25% of his cash. And the bank closed. And he lost 65% of the funds that was in that. And that money was dedicated to build a house. And now he was questioning whether or not that was ever going to happen. But the fortunate side of this story at that point in time was for his wedding gift, his mother, his father had since passed, had gave my grandfather and my grandmother $1,000, which is about $16,000, $17,000 today. And that came in and saved him and kept his ability to potentially buy a house after losing all this money in the closure of the savings account. So they put that to bear. They got the funds for the house. Another little piece of depression that I think was only fortunate for people that had means was they didn't get a mortgage from a bank or a financial institution. The family didn't trust them, not only of the bank closure, my grandfather's, but other situations with the banks. So my great-grandmother, my grandmother's father, wrote the mortgage paper for the house at 3805 Ewing. The house, as Nicola said, was valued at $7,500. The mortgage was just under $3,200. and they moved into the house with my mother, Susan, who's the eldest of two, my Aunt Ann. Auntie Ann, as we called her, was 2 years younger, and my mother was 6 months old when they moved into 3805, and that you saw the picture previously of her sitting in the sled in the driveway just shortly after. So they moved into the house. A month after they moved in, on March 3rd, 1933, the President of the United States declared that all banks would be closed in the country because there was a run on the banks, and they wanted to hold assets tight. At the same time, my grandfather's company wasn't doing well at all, and in 1931, he was making a very nice income for that year. He made $5,000 in 1931. In 1933, for the company to survive, they cut all salaries, and his income dropped to $1,800 salary. They weren't sure they could pay the mortgage on the house, and as my grandfather told me years ago, when you make a financial obligation, you stick with it. You don't go to the person that gave you the loan and ask for an extension. You made a commitment, you hold to it. So he didn't want to go to his mother to try to extend. Well, the other fortuitous thing that happened to them at that time was, I'm not sure if it was an aunt or if it was a sister of an aunt, but in any event, a family member died, and in her will, she left my grandfather $2,000. And this was within 3 months of his salary being cut. And so he was able to take that $2,000, go to his mother, and renegotiate the mortgage to bring it down, and they were able to stay in 3805 at his lower salary. Now, my grandmother, out of college, got a job at Dayton's as a clothing buyer when she was single, and so she traveled to Chicago and New York a lot to buy clothes. And if any of you remember the Oval Room at Dayton's, she was focused in on high-end women's clothing, which I remember as a kid, just the knockout clothing that my grandmother wore. But as soon as my mom was born, you quit your job and you stayed home to raise the children. And so that's what grandmother did. So this, again, World War I, Spanish flu, depression, the ebbs and flows, plus these fortuitous financial events of my grandparents allowed them not only to build the house, but to stay in it. Real quick to close out on that piece of their history, my grandfather, as Nicola said, started his own general contracting company called Liebeck & Company. He was officed out of the Baker Building downtown. They built a lot of the elementary and middle schools around the greater Twin Cities in the 1950s, particularly in the first-ring suburbs. There are a lot of those era of schools. I call them the one-story Rambler schools. He built those. He did a lot of the street lighting in the city of Minneapolis. I live in Minnetonka now on the property where my mother, who grew up at 3805, and my father built their home. And as a housewarming gift, my grandfather and grandmother gave them a Minneapolis street lamp, which still stands in our front yard. And after they sold the house to the Pines in 1974, they bought a home in Edina at 54th and Kellogg. They downsized and they put one of those street lamps in that yard, which is still there today. So in any event, that's what he did until he retired in about 1977. And I'll close with some of my memories of 3805 as a child. And I'll start with these lights again. When you walk into the front door of the house, the living room is to the right, the dining room is to the left. And when I went into the house a year and a half ago, that dining room looked a lot smaller now than it did in 1974. But we never had photos of my grandfather because he was the one taking the pictures. But he had a little wind-up 8mm camera. And you see the empty seat here at the dining room table. That's Grandpa's. Grandpa was the guy always taking the pictures, always taking the movies. Well, when he took the movies, he had to have these towers with those huge bright lights. And he had 3 of them right at the entry to the dining room. And if you look at any of our home movies, and thankfully we now have them on DVD, any person who was under the age of 10 was squinting. You didn't see their eyes because Grandpa was up there and he'd take a shot for 8 seconds and then have to wind up the camera and take it again. But the photo you have here is my grandmother at the end, Grandma Bert, on the right side of the table in front in the navy blue dress with the white collar is my mother, Susan. Next to her is my aunt, my mom's younger sister, Anne. And then across the table is 2 high school friends of my mother that have joined the family for Thanksgiving. We lived in Australia for 2 years when I was in 3rd and 4th grade, and when we came back the end of 1973, we lived at the house for a month. I, again, walked in a year and a half ago and wonder how we made that happen, but listening to Nicola and her family talk about all the people that you fit in over the years, it worked. This picture right here is in the kitchen. My grandma Bert and my mother Sue and my aunt Ann washing the dishes. This is around the 1950s. They had remodeled the kitchen by then, the steel cabinetry. You can't see it, but the icebox was gone. There was a refrigerator in there now. And a little bit of trivia, in 1973, they won the Twin Cities Award for the oldest washing machine. It was one of those cylinder ones that, you put the clothes through. It was a Maytag from 1936, and they won that in the early 70s. Let's see, and I think this is a picture from, this is my first Christmas. This is December 1964 on the living room floor at 3805. I'm the little one. That's my grandfather, Carl, my grandmother, Bert. And as I said at the outset, when I walked in a year and a half ago, it was the same fireplace screen, and the same fireplace tools. And I got to tell you what, that was special. It was really special to see that. I think I'm coming to the end, aren't I? Yeah. There's a little den area off above the garage, and this is where Grandpa and Grandma like to put the babies to play because it was a pretty safe room. You can see a lot of sofas and just kind of one hard cabinet to knock your head into. Otherwise, and that's my mother in the background. And this is in the what I now know is a wee little kitchen. I don't know how they got a kitchen table in there, but it's my grandmother and I having lunch in the kitchen. And I think to close out, there's some slides of the new owners and what they've done to the house. So with that, just a little perspective on what happened at the start and the build of this and over the years. And again, I want to thank Nicola for the opportunity to be here tonight.
Thanks. So I'm just going to zoom out again for a couple minutes, just continuing with my research. I was able to find a lot of photos of aerial photos of the city, of what the neighborhood looked like, and so this photo is from probably the 1960s. I don't have the date on here, but what I thought was interesting about it is that, like I said before, there was this big period of time where there were no other houses on the block except for those 5 up at the top of the hill, and in the 50s, after the war was over and there were materials were available again for people to build, there was a huge need for housing, and so a number of duplexes went up on the block. I think there were 5 duplexes, so it's a very interesting block with these 5 houses at the top of the hill from the 1930s, and then the rest of the block being houses from the 1960s, and then I think there's one from maybe 1980. So it's just it gives the block a really interesting look. It doesn't look a lot like other parts of the neighborhood. And one interesting thing I found out about more recently is that I was on a Linden Hills history study group walking tour of the neighborhood, and Peter Sussman, who I'm not sure if he's here or not, but he was leading the tour, and talked about how actually his father was the one who constructed those duplexes on the block, and because that area was so marshy, they actually had to dig really deep pilings into the ground to even make those duplexes stable. And you can still see when you walk down the street there, the land is just it's undulating. There's some issues with the land because it, like I said, it was built on a marsh, and it's just very unstable. So yeah, back to what Carl was saying. In 1974, the Liebecks sold the house to my parents, and this is the house in 1974. You can see the for sale sign in front of the house. And shortly after they sold the house to my parents, Carl Adamek came over one day and gave my parents this drawing of the house that he had done, which we still have today, and we have given a copy to Carl and his sister, and also to the new owners of the house. So it's a really special thing for us. But I wanted to just talk quickly about the house and the time that I was living there. My parents chose Minneapolis so that my dad, who was a family physician, could practice at Park Nicollet Medical Center on Excelsior Boulevard. And coincidentally, Carl Adamek was the contractor who built the original St. Louis Park Medical Clinic building in the 1950s. And that first meeting with the group of doctors who started that practice actually took place at their house. So in the 1950s, those doctors came to their house and signed the loan paperwork before that clinic was built. And while some areas of the house, like the kitchen and basement, were remodeled in the 1980s and a new gazebo was built, most of the house stayed virtually the same, as Carl has said, and the only changes really were the paint color, the wallpaper, and the carpeting. And so because of that, when you look at photos of the house, so many of the features look the same regardless of the time period. So this is my dad and my sister in the kitchen. And this is one of the upstairs bedrooms in the 80s, as you can probably guess from the bright-colored wallpaper and carpeting. And then same time period, 1980, this is the back of the house, which looks virtually the same as it did 30 years prior. And another shot of the stone wall that was original to the house with my sister and brother sitting on the wall and some neighborhood kids. And then this is the house. This is what the dining room and the living room looked like. This is in like 2015, I think, around then. Same living room and, same mantelpiece. And I just wanted to say that my family just feels really lucky to have spent 49 years and 3 generations in this house and to have been stewards of it for so many years. And while we were sad to leave it, we also were really glad to find new owners who were interested in preserving many historical elements of the house while also making the house functional for their family. And I was lucky enough to be invited to their housewarming party a few months ago, and so this is their take on the dining room, the living room that I just showed before. New paint color, but looks pretty similar still. And then they did some work to expand the kitchen, which was very small. The bathroom was extremely tiny. And so what you're looking at is the remodeled kitchen, and which is now actually what was the footprint of where the kitchen was is actually the pantry on the right with those glass windows. And then on the left is the expanded kitchen, which actually was built out. There's an addition on the back of the house where that new kitchen is. And then this is the floor plan of on the left is the original, and then on the right is the remodeled. So you can see on the left and the back is where that addition was added on for the kitchen, and then the upstairs bedroom. And then just the last little grace note is just that they did some really nice, very sweet touching nods to the previous owners. The study, which Carl showed the photo of the kids in the playroom, there was some cabinetry in there. And when they rebuilt that study, they actually took a fleur-de-lis, which is the image on the bottom, which was on some cabinets in the basement. And they took that image and put it on the cabinets in the new study, which was really cool. And then also they expanded the bathroom, which I don't have a photo of it, but it was extremely tiny. And they chose a wallpaper with the name Pine, which is my family name. So just another very sweet nod to the previous owners. Just to close out, researching my parents' house was an incredibly rewarding experience. I learned a lot about the block I grew on, the family that lived there before mine, and unique aspects of the house's construction. And it really opened up more questions than answers for me and many more research projects. And if you want to do research on the history of your house, a great place to start is the Minneapolis Public Library online collection. You can find your original house permit card. You can use reverse city directories to find out who lived in your house, where they worked, thousands of historical photos of Minneapolis. And once you have the building permit numbers, you can find the actual building permits on the City of Minneapolis website. I also use census records, newspaper archives, and Ancestry.com to find genealogy information. And I recommend the book Minnesota Makoche, which is about the land of the Dakota people, to learn about the history of them in Minnesota. So finally, special thanks to Carl and Maggie for meeting with us and also taking the time to share their photos and stories about their grandparents. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this and learned some, got tuned into some of our former and present residents. So anyway, thank you.